Hello everyone, this is Mehdi and welcome to another episode of the Subcontinent. Our program aims to address important issues in the subcontinent which affect the governments, people, organizations and the region as a whole. We will try to explain the issues, break down controversies surrounding them and try to have some external perspectives from experts and people.
In this edition of the Subcontinent, we are going to talk about the fate of United States military in Afghanistan following the September 11 deadline for the complete withdrawal. Then we will explore the contingencies of the Biden administration to maintain its influence in the country and the region.
The Biden administration says the U.S. military forces are set to leave Afghanistan by the anniversary of the September 11 attacks, after 20 years of costly attrition warfare. However, many people doubt that the United States would leave the region for good, as it is using every trick of the game to stall its military withdrawal from Afghanistan. The Biden administration has postponed or revised the deadline a few times. It seems that the authorities in Washington are only trying to buy time, hoping a solution would pop up for the predicament the U.S. has created in Afghanistan, which might be spiraling out to the entire region.
The United States is bogged down in a quagmire of its own making, and with every move it only goes deeper. It knows its military presence in Afghanistan has been nothing but failure, but at this point, every possible scenario can lead to even bigger failures. It may manage to remove some troops, but the idea of no air support there means total desperation in case of a Taliban takeover. The Biden administration may be seeking a way to pull out of the accord and not out of the country. Biden may opt to cite Taliban violations or delays in peace talks with the Afghan government as justification for maintaining an indefinite military presence, or ask the Taliban for an extension of the withdrawal deadline. In any case, this means the escalations of war in Afghanistan. Moreover, the United States and its interventions seem to be among the forces behind the rise of another threat for Afghanistan, the resurgence of Takfiris, or the remnants of Daesh, as they are emboldened by US open talks with Taliban and Washington's move to release thousands of terrorists from prison as part of their deal. The US-Taliban talks in Qatar were meant to stop the violence in the country, but the bloodshed has been relentless as more terrorists are being recruited. The US failing strategy for leaving the country is something terrorists are counting on.
No possible scenarios can be favorable for Washington. If it leaves Afghanistan for good, it loses its stand in the region after 2 decades of useless and costly occupation. Moreover, the US has massive amounts of assets and military equipment in Afghanistan that may end up in the hands of terrorists following the pullout. Besides, Washington has no way to know if Taliban is keeping up with its commitments without the proper intelligence gathering operations. There is no victory in this war, as all future possibilities lead to different levels of defeat for Washington.
According to the deal signed between Washington and Taliban late in February 2020 in Qatar's Doha, the US promised the complete withdrawal of all American and NATO troops from Afghanistan if Taliban prevents al-Qaeda and other terrorist outfits from operating against the US and its allies. Taliban also promised to engage in talks with the Afghan government and distance itself from al-Qaeda. Now, after 2 decades of war with Taliban, Washington seems more and more dependent on the group's approval for any future actions in Afghanistan. And the group, which seems to have the upper hand after 20 years of war against the US, has not accepted any of Washington's proposed mechanisms for the future of US forces. Therefore, the US will have to either find ways to linger its presence in the country or find alternatives that are less costly.
The US invaded Afghanistan in the name of war on terror, ostensibly to bring peace and stability, to promote social security and education for women. In other words, to curb terrorism and influence of Taliban over the nation. It has achieved almost none of its important promulgated goals. I mean the ones that really matter for the country and its people, not just a few trophy operations.
The United States is moving most of its forces to nearby countries or even further countries. The US and probably many others in this case fear that Taliban wants to take absolute control in Kabul and will take actions as soon as the US pullout paves the way. However, many people, including some inside Taliban's ruling circles, want assurance that the US won't return its troops after a period of strategic replacement around the continent. If the United States wants to continue its airstrikes or other so-called counter-terrorism operation in the region following the supposed withdrawal from Afghanistan, it needs to be close, so all the neighbors of Afghanistan and other regional countries can be viable destinations. The United States has numerous military bases throughout the world. Biden administration might be looking for some alternatives to keep the US foothold in the region, to provide security for the US interests and gather intelligence, and in general, to maintain its military leverage for any future developments in Afghanistan. The US needs to remain its forces close by.
Washington has no leverage against Taliban. It has no way to guarantee Taliban would not move to gain control over the country. Nobody is sure of Afghan security forces' capability to counter the increasing terrorist attacks in the country. Also, there is nothing to ensure that Kabul can survive the resurgence of Takfiri terrorists in the region. The authorities in the American military are negotiating with the nations surrounding Afghanistan on agreements to base troops and aircraft for operations inside the country following the withdrawal. But the US plans to maintain its military foothold in the region are being nullified one after the other.
One of Washington's plans was to use Pakistan as a base for its air operations, which is rejected by the Pakistani government. Islamabad's cooperation with Washington has the potential to affect the US-Taliban negotiations in particular and the future of the US in the region in general. However, most people believe that Islamabad is unlikely to sign off on any US strikes against the Taliban that are launched from a base in Pakistan. NATO officials have also approached Qatar seeking access to one of its military bases for much-needed training of Afghan special forces. Qatar has not responded to the request yet. The US is also considering other Asian countries as its contingency plan in case it would need its drones over Afghanistan. Some of them seem more favorable or plausible than others, such as Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan.
There has been some talk, for instance, that Uzbekistan may cooperate, not necessarily regarding bases for unmanned aircraft systems, UAS, for drones, but there has been an increase in the level of cooperation between Uzbekistan and the US since, I believe, 2016. So it might be. Of course, the Russians wouldn't be happy. They consider Central Asia like their backyard, and the Chinese wouldn't be happy either. They don't like the fact that there would be a US and NATO presence in Central Asia, especially with US and NATO forces in Afghanistan. But there might be an option, perhaps a less likely option will be Tajikistan, but there has been some cooperation in the military area, security, border security area between the United States and Tajikistan, although the Russians have a military base protecting the border of Tajikistan with Afghanistan. So perhaps wouldn't be the idea there, might not crystallize or might not become reality, the idea of a military presence, U.S. military presence in Tajikistan. Might it be? Could it be in Uzbekistan? Maybe, maybe not. Pakistan, well, the Pakistanis say no, but they could change their mind too. There could be some trade-offs, some negotiations between the U.S. I don't think it's the last word. And there might be that in the end, the U.S. might have bases or a base in Pakistan, perhaps even a secret one, non-official. It's not one that would exist, but it will be there, like it happened before with the CIA unmanned aircraft systems, the Predators, the Reapers, I believe too. Another option might be, but then again, it will require permission for airspace travel, etc. It just occurs to me. Azerbaijan, maybe. Could it be Azerbaijan, a base?
Another plausible contingency was using Turkey as something in between, because it is a NATO member and also a Muslim country. Moreover, Ankara really needs to mend its ties with Washington after its acquisition of the Russian S-400 missile defense system. Turkey has long provided security at Kabul's airport and has offered to continue doing so, but this scenario was also nipped in the bud. Taliban says it would not accept the idea of keeping the Turkish forces in the country following the withdrawal.
The Taliban wouldn't accept the idea of Turkish troops remaining in Afghanistan to keep some sort of security. Like, for instance, the Turks have been responsible with 500 soldiers. They have been responsible for the security of Kabul International Airport. But the thing is that the Taliban see any foreign troop as what they are, foreigners, foreign occupying force. And it doesn't matter that Turkey is Muslim, it doesn't matter that they are Sunni Muslim, like the Taliban and the Pashtuns in Afghanistan are Sunni Muslims. It doesn't matter to the Taliban, they are foreigners, they are invaders to them, so they got to go. And that's as simple as that. I mean, there is no other way to try to find a compromise for the Taliban. They're uncompromising on that. No foreigners on Afghan soil, and I suppose it's because they see the situation that it got to be as it was in 2001 before the US intervened. No foreigners there.
Now to have more insight, we are joined by Major David McBride, a former Australian Army legal officer who completed 2 deployments to Afghanistan as part of International Security Assistance Force. First of all, I would like to thank Mr. McBride for being on the program and begin by asking why the Biden administration keeps postponing the U.S. military withdrawal from Afghanistan.
I think that they can see it's going to be bad for them politically. It's not their fault. This is a bad debt that was created by George W. Bush 20 years ago. I believe the only reason they invaded Afghanistan was to get popularity domestically and to win the 2004 election. And now it has been seen to be a long-term failure. And the problem that President Biden has is that when he withdraws, there will almost certainly be chaos in the country. And that will be laid at his feet rather than where it properly should be laid at the previous administrations.
To maintain its military leverage for any future developments in Afghanistan, the U.S. is moving most of its forces to nearby countries like Pakistan, for example. Now, how can Islamabad's cooperation with Washington affect the U.S.-Taliban negotiations in particular and the future of the U.S. in the region in general?
Yes, it's a good question. The role of Pakistan in Afghanistan is very unclear, but the one thing which is certain is that they do not play with a straight deck. Duplicity is part of their game in Afghanistan. One of the problems or worries that Pakistan has is that the Indians or even the Chinese, the two countries on their other borders, might gain a foothold in Afghanistan by offering the Afghans aid and assistance in rebuilding their nation. And that worries the Pakistanis. There was no doubt, it shows you how what a complicated game Pakistan plays. And even though they were fighting what is called the Pakistani Taliban for many years in quite a bit of fight, they were sponsoring the Afghan Taliban, even though the two organizations were not that different, because they wanted to be able to control the Afghan Taliban and therefore control Afghanistan. Now, they will not want to be seen, like every government wants, in order to win popular support, you need to make a section of the public think that you are strong. And if whatever deals they do behind closed doors, the Pakistan government does not want to be seen to be completely beholden to America. They do a lot of rallying to the Pakistani national cause. This is bad if it looks like they've just become an American vassal state, staging base, so they don't want the American forces being based there. And they have also got very strong links to the Taliban, and they probably are not negotiating with the Taliban with the Americans, and they're not going to reveal their links. I think it's a good thing that the Pakistanis do not want the American bases there.
Thank you, Mr. McBride. And before asking the next set of questions, let's take a look at the issue of U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan through the lens of global media outlets.
The Biden administration is struggling to articulate how it will keep Afghanistan from falling to the Taliban after American forces depart, even as the U.S. is more than halfway through its troop withdrawal. The Pentagon's top brass have insisted the U.S. military will conduct operations launched from outside the country if needed, but they've offered few details on logistics such as where those troops would be based. U.S. air support has already risen in recent weeks to counter the Taliban's offensives. The insurgents have already seized several districts and overrun Afghan military bases. The Taliban have overrun nearly 40 districts across the country in the past month. Out of 387 districts in Afghanistan, the fighting is ongoing in 116 districts in the country. In a statement about hosting U.S. military bases, the Taliban said, "We are asking neighboring countries not to provide such an opportunity or allow such a move. If, God forbid, still someone allows this, this will be a historic mistake and ignominy." It described the presence of U.S.-led foreign forces in Afghanistan as the fundamental reason for regional insecurity and war, adding that the group would not remain silent against such a heinous and provocative act.
Now Washington has to coordinate with Taliban for any future moves, and Taliban doesn't seem to be cooperating. And the proof is the rise of terrorist attacks. Will the US find a way to prolong its stay, or will it leave the country to a more powerful and resourceful Taliban?
Well, we don't know the answer to that question. It'll be one of the two, and it's both. They're both depressing. There is no doubt about it. While the US will try to paint the Taliban as the bad guy in the situation, as you suggested, the US under President Trump gave the order to withdraw all forces by the end of 2020. Now that didn't happen, and the military pushed back and said, "Oh, this is too hard." Now that's not their role, and actually, the Americans had very much the ability. The one thing they are really good at is logistics, and they could have taken everybody out in 2020. Now, then they said May 2021, and they didn't meet that deadline either. And they put it off to September. So they received attacks after they failed to keep their word about the deadlines. Now, the Taliban can rightly argue the Americans are the ones that broke their word. And of course we attacked when you didn't keep your word. And that's a warning to you that if you don't keep your word in September, we'll attack more. I think that the date of the 11th of September was a very curious and strange choice. There will obviously be attacks on that anniversary anyway. And the Americans, you're right, one possibility is that they will use the attacks on 11th September or thereabouts to keep their forces there. It's a bit of a phony withdrawal.
Mr. McBride, the U.S. invaded Afghanistan ostensibly to bring peace and stability. In other words, to curb terrorism and influence of Taliban. Now, do you think it achieved any of its objectives?
No, they didn't. And they, as you said, they've made the Taliban resurgent and different. The Taliban, so-called Taliban now, are quite different to the amateur band of believers who took over the country in 1996. It is now a different organisation, and the Americans have created that. And yes, they've made them stronger. And in the same way that Americans use enemies like China or Russia to build their own strength domestically, the Taliban have been able to do that as well, and they've made themselves stronger by the Americans. The two organisations have more in common than they'd like to admit. So they've definitely given the country that the Taliban will be in control. They have made them stronger. So they haven't improved the life. It's a lie for the Americans to say they were there to help women and children. If they really wanted to help women and children, they shouldn't have fought the Soviet invasion. Apparently more girls were at school during the years after the Soviet invasion than they've ever been since. But the Americans couldn't handle the Soviets being there. So they fought a proxy war with this hardline Islamic tribesmen, and schooling has never been a thing in Afghanistan since. But that's the Americans' fault as much as anybody else.
Mr. McBride, thank you for your precious time. And now let's see how the people have reacted on social media and cyberspace.
Samira Hamidi has expressed hope about the agreement for the US withdrawal would be implemented on the ground, but she says she is aware of the US earliest dirty games on similar circumstances. Mehr Tarar has hailed Pakistan's Premier Khan for his firm response about the possibility of US bases in the Pakistani territory. James Gordon Meek believes the day American forces leave Afghanistan is the real Independence Day for the people of Afghanistan. Michael Tackett has reiterated the remarks by former President Karzai, pointing out that extremism is at its highest point and the United States is leaving behind a disaster. Sushan Sarin has voiced his concern about the possibility of a takeover by Taliban, questioning the US logic or fake hope that it can have some sort of control over Taliban's activities in Afghanistan from a base in Pakistan.
And that was our episode about the US quandary in Afghanistan and its contingencies for future scenarios. To watch bits and pieces of our show and more subcontinental updates, follow us on social media platforms. And don't forget to give us your feedback. We shall meet again, same time, same day next week. So till then, take care.